I guess I have the unenviable task of keeping people awake today after lunch, so I will try to do so. Following upon three distinguished professors, you're going to find my talk to be a very, very different perspective. I think this morning we got some fairly interesting, but fairly macroeconomic and academic views about China. I'm coming purely from a practitioner's point of view. Just sort of to let you know a little bit more about myself, to give you perspective. P Capital is a merchant bank that's based in Hong Kong. We have offices in Beijing, and we basically advise on both the principal side as well as advisory basis, buying and selling companies and assets in China, and more importantly, how do you create value from that? And that involves, for us, as very, very active investors, we hire and fire. I've hired and fired at least a dozen CEOs in the last 5 years in China. How do you squeeze assets? How do you restructure assets? How do you work with the government in a win-win position? And sometimes we don't do as well and we lose, but we learn. Both my partner and I have been in China for a long time. Prior to starting P Capital, I was one of the founding partners of Carlyle Asia, which some of you may know is one of the large buyout funds in Asia, Pan-Asian, $750 million. And I actually started my life as a banker for Merrill, 7 years in New York, 5 years in Hong Kong. I'd like to start by talking about the conventional wisdom. This morning we actually heard some of it, both in the discussion groups as well as by the professors. But China, the short answer is huge, right? Everything I hear about China is big, it's massive, it's huge, it's number one, it's number this. Also, there's a view that China is one country. It's uniform. It's one people, one culture, one language. People also have this kind of third world view about it. We heard at great length this morning about corruption. But people also think it's chaotic. The other word people talk about China is cheap. It's so cheap, right? And finally, the last comment I'll say, I'd say the conventional wisdom thinks China is a very unsophisticated economy. Classless society, right, from the communist era, undiscriminating population. They don't know the difference between quality or not, and they don't care. And that economy is still so very centrally overregulated. Some of Sanjay's questions earlier were talking about that. And the last comment I'll make about China, and I hear this in the echoes about the discussion about the trade relationship between the EU and in China, is that China is focused only on price. It's cheap, 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 and who cares about IP, right? So we can beg, borrow, steal IP, who cares? I think that's a good summary of how a lot of people think about China. I will echo, and we've seen numbers a lot today, that China is big, right? And so there is some grain of truth to the conventional wisdom about China. You've got 1.3 billion people. But my comment is people almost get bored by the number, 1.3 billion. What does that mean in real life? That means 2 provinces have populations greater than Germany. Another 6 provinces are greater than France. GDP rank, 1.4 trillion is 2003 numbers, is about 1.6.5 trillion 2005 numbers, or 2004 numbers, and PPP 6.4 trillion. Huge numbers again. Foreign exchange reserves are absolutely appalling, 650 billion. GDP growth is 8.5% on average for every single year in the past decade. Export growth has been growing at 19.5% every single year for 10 years. And finally, they've attracted $430 billion of FDI. My one pause comment here, and I'm maybe a banker, and we banker types are very simple people. This slide does not match with the previous slide. If China really had such unsophisticated, cheap, unmanaged, classless society people, how could you possibly have accomplished this type of stuff in 10 years? And so a lot of my focus here is talking about the conundrum of China. There are a couple words we like using at P Capital. One is conundrum of China. It is a contradiction of many, many things. This picture, just one comment, is a picture of Europe, rotate a little bit to make it fit better on China. And I use this as a Rorschach test about how people perceive China and Europe. Most people look at this and say, this proves one massive China. Look at this country. It's so big, it's bigger than Europe. And you got 1.3 billion people. My comment is a question. Is there one Europe? Or, as we heard earlier, are there 25 Europes? In other words, multiple Europes. Our thesis is there are multiple Chinas. China is not one country. And we're not talking about politics. For this talk, let's ignore politics. Right? I'll leave that to the politicians who do it much better than I do. I'm talking about economy. I'm talking about business. I'm talking about how do you make money. And China is at least 4 different countries. The other comment I'll make is Europe. If you talk to a lot of Chinese people, they think all Europeans look the same. That's pretty funny, right? Coming back the other way. Clearly, a Spaniard probably looks a little bit different than a Swede, and certainly talks a little different than someone in Greece or Germany. China has at least as much ethnic variety within China. The government classifies 55 races in China. Races, right? Not uniform. At least 450 different languages. If you go from China from the north to the south, you have height variations. People are shocked that Yao Ming is so tall. Go to the north. There are a lot of very tall Chinese. I'm not that tall, but there's some really tall Chinese. You go out to the west in Xinjiang, you have blonde-haired, blue-eyed Chinese. Genetically, they're not ethnically Asian. Genetically, they're actually from Russia and from Europe, but they're still Chinese. And so the comment I'm making here is China is as big as a continent, and you have the variety in terms of people, culture, habits that you'll find in Europe. The languages are more different than French, Italian, Spanish, the 3 major dialects. And I haven't gotten to the little hill tribes down here which speak very, very foreign languages. Since we're at a conference, we had to do a little bit of numbers. Now, I emphasize these are not politically based numbers, meaning that you will not find a Chinese government report that defines China into what we call a P capital of 4 Chinas. First China, coastal China, interior China, and outer China. This was an intellectual construct that we did. What I find interesting, though, is the government, under Mr. Wang Yiming, is actually tracking this indirectly already. So I think the policymakers in China are aware that it is a very different type of country. Let me just give you some broad brush strokes. First of all, let's talk about First China. And I'm going to talk numbers right now. I will qualitatively describe the 4 different regions in a second. But the comment I'll make here is look at the ratio of population, area, and GDP. First China, 3% of the land, not much land. 12% of the population is still 154 million people. That's the size of Russia, guys. The other Chinas are much bigger. Outer China, the extreme. You've got 215 million people, maybe nothing by Chinese standards, but that's still a lot of people by most country standards, and a huge amount of land. Look at the density variation. 36 people per kilometer versus 540. That is not that dense, guys. Right? This is less dense than a ton of countries and less dense than most of Europe. But the real shocking number that people talk about, and I think a couple of professors hinted at, but people don't like to quantify because politically it's sensitive, is look at the per capita GDP. This is based on 2003 numbers. The last year I could get actual by province. Per capita is 1277. Outer China is 723. Look at the multiples. Interior China is 20% wealthier on average than outer China, and coastal China is 30% more. Well, look at First China. The multiple is 5.9 times. So let me say it differently. Economically, what's happened in the last 20 years is, yes, there's been growth in all of China, and people talk about 1.3 billion, but almost all the wealth, I'm talking about the vast, vast, vast majority, has accrued to only 12% of the population. And they have outsized incomes, and 90+% of the exports. It's hard to get the numbers, but I would personally estimate that probably 99.5% of the exports going to China, to the EU, going to the US, going around the world, are coming from only First China. The other 3 regions are not exporting, guys. And so how can a little country, by Chinese standards, although it's a Russian-sized country in terms of population, be really taking on the whole world and racking up $600 billion of foreign reserve, all this FDI, all this other stuff? Just graphically giving you a little bit of sense, there's one error on this map. This thing is supposed to be the coastal thing here in Shaanxi, but we couldn't correct it in time. Look at, and if people actually know Chinese history, this actually makes a lot more sense than it does. The purple areas outer China are generally autonomous regions. This is where the heterogeneous population is. Most of the foreign minority races are in those purple areas. This is where China has a huge religious problem. We have a Muslim issue out here. And down here you have a drug issue. And so if you look at the purple, this is a very large, not very populated, landlocked area. And the other comment I'll make about this is people don't realize how high this is. This is a Tibetan plateau. Average height in most of these areas in the valleys is 3,000 to 4,000 meters. That's the valleys, guys. And if you're not in the middle of these insanely high plateaus, you have desert, the Gobi Desert. So this isn't a particularly lush, wonderful place to go. This is mountaineering country. Interior China is ethnically Han, which is the dominant race, which most people think are Chinese are really Han. A lot of people in here, very landlocked is a comment I'll make, and relatively a poor area. And the coast that people talk about is this light blue. And you can argue whether the real far northeast, Heilongjiang, should be part of this, but to make the argument simpler, let's leave it on the coast. First China is basically 3 circles. And half the circle, about 100-mile radius around the cities, are in the sea, in the case of Hong Kong and Shanghai, and Beijing is the so-called Bohai region. The other comment I'll make here that you should observe is this is not centered around Shenzhen or Guangzhou. This is centered around Hong Kong. Outer China. Huge, right? A little bit smaller than Australia, twice the size of either India or Argentina. Big people, lots of people, a couple 100 million people. But the important stuff is it's a complicated region, slow growth, heterogeneous. Mountains, deserts, inaccessible. But the good news here is it actually has a lot of natural resources. Most of the worst areas to live as a person are where the oil, the minerals, and all that stuff are. So if you look at this region, you actually have the potential for sort of a natural resource-based economy that makes sense. The problem is you're in Tibet and the plateau at 4,000 or 5,000 meters, and how do you get iron ore or coal from mountains to mountain valleys back up again? Interior China. This is the worst part of China if I were a citizen of China. Almost 500 million people, which is a huge country by any normal measure. It's big. It's about 3 times the size of Spain. I've been trying to get some metrics in Europe. Or France, Spain, Germany, and Italy combined in terms of land area. So it's a pretty big area, but it's still very dense. And it's poor, and it's landlocked, and the resource constrained. Let me say it differently. This is where all the migrant workers are coming from, or a ton of them. There is no reason for a normal person to want to live in this part of China. Problem, there are 500 million of them. Coastal China. We have a slightly different take on coastal China than a lot of the official documents out there. People talk about the coastal regions. Most of the coast actually isn't that wealthy, right? That sort of light blue strip coming down the edge of China. First of all, there's still a lot of people here, 429 million people, which is just an insane amount of people. It's large. It's about the same size as interior China. But they have 2 things going for it that are really pretty important. First of all, they are immediately adjacently surrounding First China. And therefore, they are the immediate beneficiaries of any of the diffusion of wealth, of education, of culture, of government processes that are going on in First China. And so they lever that. Secondly, they are on the coast. And again, in a modern economy in which global trade is everything, having access to the sea is what you need. Otherwise, you can't get your stuff from point A to point B. Finally, First China. I'll make a comment. We don't even bother investing in other 3 regions. And even in First China, we only really invest in Beijing area, Bohai, and in Shanghai. And we will do Hong Kong. We do not like Shenzhen, Guangdong, and Guangzhou. And I can talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested why. And so as we look at First China, the couple comments we'll make here is, people say, well, John, you're only focused on 3 cities. But these 3 city region areas have as many people, frankly, as a big country, 150 million, It's big as Italy, so it's not an irrelevant little country, and it's very dense. The densest country I could find, except for Monaco, was Netherlands. And this is more dense. So you have a ton of people. You got money. I will comment, per capita GDP already is in lower EU stuff, right? Lithuania, Latvia. So people talk about how cheap China is, how poor China is. Time out. First, China isn't that cheap. I can find you 50 to 100 countries, most of ASEAN, all of Africa, India, Indonesia, are cheaper than first China. And this is where the manufacturing prowess is. So it's not as simple as cost. And the other comment I'll make here is the other thesis we have, and remember, we're not talking about politics. In terms of business, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and first China have already integrated. Past tense. It's not to come. Taiwan, an island of 23 million people, have over 1 million citizens living full-time and working in China. Estimates show between $100 to $150 billion of Taiwanese capital is invested in the mainland. This is a lot of money. Integration has occurred already. Hong Kong ditto. Everyone knows the Hong Kong family story. Most of Hong Kong families, no one makes anything in Hong Kong anymore, which is one of the economic problems of Hong Kong, but they're making it in southern China or increasing it to Jiangsu and Shanghai. The other comment I'll make, and by the way, combined, if you buy that, this economy is already at 1.1 trillion and number 8 in the world. The other comment I'll make here is the stated goal in this region, particularly in Shanghai, is to get to a minimum of $10,000 per capita GDP. And Shanghai are very ambitious Shanghainese within 5 years or less. But if the whole region gets to $10,000, combine that with Hong Kong and Taiwan, you got something bigger than Germany is today. And it's likely to be, given the current German growth rates. So you got an economic powerhouse now with a population of Russia that will be driving a Germany-sized economy trying to catch Japan as soon as possible. The other comment I'll make here is this is where the logistics and ports make a big deal. And I'll talk about it in a case study. Why? I've heard arguments that first China exists purely because of geography. If you go build some more railroads into interior China, you give them some tax breaks, buy a few colleges, suddenly first China is irrelevant because the middle of Guangxi province, you'll suddenly get great factories. We would probably beg to differ. We think there are really 4 things that make first China, and the rest of China not first China. You got a cultural issue. This is part of the country where traditionally the educated elite have always lived. This is where you have thousands of years of both political control mechanisms. You have the whole Mandarin system. You have a population that's focused on education. This is where the human infrastructure really is. You also have the physical infrastructure. This A is where the government's put the money in building it, but B, where they got lucky, right? Hong Kong, that region exists. Guangdong province was an outlier. It was an irrelevant region 50 years ago. They exist because they're next door to Hong Kong, and all the Hong Kong money went in and built it up. But the core reason, actually, is something that's really basic that a lot of people don't actually talk about. And it's called educational disparities. This was a study done by Tsinghua University and the World Bank, I believe in about 2001, beginning of 2002. And they went and, again, to most Chinese, this is not a shocking development, and measured educational attainment by the average population and tried to measure the disparity by region. An average number for China is about 100, is how they normalize the index. And you look at the variation here. 3 provinces, Tibet, Qinghai, Yunnan, and Guizhou, into the very low, right? The ratings are down in 30s and 40s. Right? Average is 100, right? Remember that outer China I kept talking about? They're all very low, between 50 and 70, right? These guys, if you will, are overachievers on Sanxi on a relative basis, and they actually get up into the below average category. But if you look at, ignoring the coast for a second, there's almost nothing that's interesting in terms of education. In the Northeast that Professor Yang was talking about was up to Jilin, Heilongjiang. Look at the provinces. The highest attainment, ignoring Shanghai and Beijing, is under 300, right? You're getting to high, very high into this region. Shanghai is here, and this is where Shanghai surrounds Jiangsu and Zhejiang. Fujian has been basically one of the hopping places for Taiwanese money. And if you look around Beijing, you get the stuff. But the interesting thing is, the rest of the country's at 100. Shanghai's at 529, and Beijing's at 606. There's not just a little bit of difference. It's just scale differences. What does that mean? Look at the intellectual talent that you have in China. The US now produces about 65,000 engineers a year. India, 100,000. China, 300,000. And most of them all live in First China. But that's not the other piece of the equation that's missing. The other piece is the Chinese are effectively leveraging the overseas Chinese. They're leveraging all the managerial engineering talent in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, the rest of the overseas Chinese community, and you've seen the studies, 200 million spread over the US and stuff, and they're all going back to China. One way of thinking about this, and this is a setup to my closing comments, is successive factories of the world. Merrill Lynch Japan did a study that showed when countries became factories of the world. The United States took over from Great Britain in 1881. And when they did so, and outproduced the Brits in terms of industrial production, they had about a 10% cost advantage. In 1979, that moved from the US to Japan. The Japanese had a 20% cost advantage, a 1.2 factor. And according to this Merrill Lynch study, and I'll push back a little bit, but I'm going to quote the study since I'm quoting the study, when it moved to China, going from Japan to China was a 32 times cost advantage. Now, I think that's overstating a little bit, given the income disparity going on. But this is combined with the top two things, lots of intellectual talent, plus pretty significant cost differences, is a combination that's driving a lot of what's going on. The value proposition, in short, in China is an and. There are 6 factors we think that create China, and it's not only one factor. A lot of what we hear being discussed in other developing countries is, let's just go give some tax incentives, or let's go educate some more people. But what the Chinese have managed to do is a very, very difficult thing of doing the ands. You got the intellectual talent, they inherited that. Low cost, high quality labor, culture produced that. Culture produces work ethic as well as entrepreneurship, and exists in spades in China. The government has been very proactive. They have a master plan and 20-year plans. I mean, they're doing everything they need to do. And the physical resource infrastructure are very, very good. I know I have a time issue, but I do want to spend a little time on a case study because I could show you more boring slides because I had promised Ignacio I'd talk about technology a little bit too, and talk about multinational decomposition, talking about value chain moving and comparative advantage. But I thought a better way of making it alive and crystallized, especially after lunch, is a case study. And I want to talk about a company called Quanta Computer. Quanta Computer embodies at least 4 or 5 of the themes I've been talking about in a real-life example. Many of you have probably never heard of Quanta Computer. It's a big Taiwanese company. My guess is you probably use one of the products. They are the largest notebook producer in the world. So you have an Apple PowerBook, an IBM ThinkPad, or Dell, it's a Quanta. If you have a Japanese computer, a Fujitsu or Sony, it's made by Quanta. And they don't make it, they design it. They're ODM, right? They're not just OEM, they're ODM. This business, to give you a quick overview, has gone from 0 to $11 billion in 2004. They'll probably do 12 to 13 billion US dollars in 2005, in 10 years. In addition to the notebook business, they have built from scratch in 5 years a display business, going to probably $2.5 billion in 2005. So in 10 years, they have built a company from 0 to be pushing 15 billion US dollars in revenues, which is a pretty big company by anyone's standards. The fact you did this de nouveau, greenfield, in the middle of nowhere is pretty amazing, actually. And the question is how and why. Let's look at how they're structured. And this shows a couple themes here. The first comment I'll make, and this is one of the sticky issues and the trade deficit issues with the US and I think with the EU, is if you buy an IBM, you think you bought an American computer. It's designed in Taiwan and made in China. Where's the origin, right? This is how interlinked this whole industry has become. They have moved 95% of the production into Shanghai. They don't make notebooks in Taiwan anymore. They design them, and they keep the display manufacturing thing here. So, if you will, the high-valued ODM IP, they leave in Taiwan for a lot of reasons I can do in Q&A. All the networking and making is done in China, and they have an ancillary operation in Taiwan. Let me finish explaining Quanta, and then I'm going to emphasize the 3 or 4 themes that it does. The first question is, this is how the Chinese kill everybody in manufacturing. Couple comments. Shanghai is the most expensive labor area in China, guys. They're not there because it's cheap, right? They are probably paying these guys, average workers, per capita GDP is already 4,000, 5,000, and it's growing 10 to 20% a year, right? So it's not cheap. They're probably paying these guys $4,000 or $5,000 a year and probably higher, right? But what they can get in Shanghai is the ecosystem, or the Japanese word is keiretsu. And they can get all the part suppliers to do whatever it takes to win. And the Chinese want to win so desperately badly. Barry Lam was telling me a story that Chinese New Year's for the Chinese is sacred days. Right? This is when the migrants can go home. And they had a new order from, I can't remember, either Dell or Apple. I think it was Apple, a new Apple launch. And they had every one of the factory workers cancel Chinese New Year's vacation and work 18 hours a day through the vacation. Not one comment, not one complaint. That's how they've moved production in 5 years. Have gone from basically $0 in Shanghai to $11 billion in Shanghai. This is talking about 3 years, guys, in terms of rapid production. So what's going on here? You really have the engineering brains of the overseas Chinese. The Taiwanese are driving it. And Barry Lam is someone who was born in Shanghai, left in 1949 and went to Hong Kong, was educated in Hong Kong, went to Taiwan and made his fortune, and now has reinvested back in Shanghai. Is he Chinese? Is he mainland Chinese? This is the integration we're talking about. And selling under foreign brands. His products are American, Japanese, or European. They have this factory that hires tens and tens of thousands of people. Look how big this thing is. I'm just astounded how big this thing is. And for this size, multiply times 10 the suppliers they have. The most astounding thing about Quanta, I've had a slide, is logistics. And I want to emphasize this, and this is where the Chinese advantage becomes the ecosystem, logistics. Most people think if you make it in China, and textiles and footwear probably is true, there's a 3-month delay to market. Under this new system, if you're in the United States and you order online a ThinkPad computer from IBM, and you type it in, boom. It goes immediately to Shanghai. They produce it within 24 hours. They have a contract, off-take contract with FedEx, and will get delivered back to the United States within 72 hours of your order. Let me say that again. This is manufactured in Shanghai on a custom-delivered basis, 0 inventory, and delivered physically in the United States in 72 hours, outside 96 hours. How do they do that? It's a combination of about 10 things. You got the suppliers who provide them the components on instant notice. You got workers, and by the way, they make every computer they do custom order, custom built. There isn't a single computer that's made for inventory. So you have the ultimate just-in-time, fully customized design process. It only exists because they have very, very high-quality IP in China in terms of people, and they're willing to do it. And they don't seem to have any IP leak problems. And so I'm going to push back a little bit that China has such a big IP problem. Yes, depends what part of China you're talking about. There are a huge amount of counterfeit issues, but there are plenty of MNCs, and I would argue Quanta is effectively an MNC, that knows how to control the IP leakage in China and control in a way that isn't an issue. One of the sensitive problems Quanta has, I asked Barry, is, wait a minute, you're designing for Sony, you're designing for Apple, you're designing for everybody. How do I know if I'm IBM that you're not going to take my ThinkPad and take the technology and give it to Sony or Fujitsu or Philips? And they have Chinese walls built in, and all the customers, and these are pretty blue-chip customers, are perfectly happy with the IP situation within both China and Taiwan. And with that, I will turn over to questions.